Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 7th, 2022. We now clearly live in an era of narratives. And one of the things about narratives is that the more they're repeated, the more they stick in people's minds and shape the way people think. Take as an example of this a comment that was written in an article by the head of U.S. Strategic Command back in February 2021, Admiral Charles Richards, who said, "Nuclear war has become a real possibility." Now we'll get back to Admiral Richard in just a moment, but think about this question of repetition of narratives. This was spelled out by George Orwell in his book Animal Farm, where the repetition by the animals, by the pigs in the story, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, became the reality of the civilization they represented. Now, Bertrand Russell had the same idea. He wrote in the early 50s that repeating something often enough will change the way people think. And the example he used is if you teach children that snow is black, eventually they'll believe it. Now, today, what's the narrative? Putin bad, Zelensky, and the neo-Nazi forces, which until recently were threatening and intimidating him, are good. And that's the narrative that's shaping the entire Western world media coverage of the confrontation going on in Ukraine today. Perhaps another way of putting it would be NATO and US war crimes in Afghanistan, in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen are good. Russian military operations are bad. Now, among yesterday's developments to reinforce the narratives, Twitter censored Scott Ritter, suspended his account. And what was the problem for Ritter? Well, he made the mistake of saying that before you level charges of war crimes, you must have evidence, and that this evidence requires an investigation, not just a few videos presented by the Ukrainians. Now, at the same time, the UN Security Council, under British direction, announced they're going to turn over the investigation of the alleged war crimes in Bucha, not to an independent panel, not to independent investigators, but to the Ukrainian special prosecutor. Then you have Liz Truss, the foreign minister of Great Britain, who led a chorus at the NATO foreign ministers meeting. More weapons for Ukraine, more powerful weapons for Ukraine, more sanctions, and no consideration of the concerns that were raised by Russia over the last 15 years about the need for security guarantees for Russia as well. Instead, there must be no rest, quote, until Putin fails, unquote. This was reiterated by German Chancellor Scholz, who said that Germany will provide more arms, will support more sanctions, and said our goal, quote, is that Russia not win this war, unquote. Does that mean the Germans will soon be fighting? Well, you can't rule anything out in this. Now, I'm working on an article to get to the bottom of where did this commitment to fighting this war come from? Why did the West refuse to negotiate in good faith with Putin and instead push Russia into a corner by allowing Ukrainian neo-Nazis and the Ukrainian Defense Forces kill Russian civilians in the Donbass with impunity? How did that happen? How did it become possible that a possible nuclear-armed Ukraine is a good thing for the West? Now, what you have is, in a sense, the merger of the policy of regime change with great power confrontation. Let me just give you an example of this. At the end of the Cold War in 1990, despite the promises that were made to Russia about no eastward expansion of NATO, we've seen a consistent eastward expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia. We had the announcement of Bush's New World Order, which was based on the idea of the U.S. as the sole superpower, the winner of the Cold War, and the world will now be a unipolar world which will march to the dictates of the U.S. and NATO military superiority. This was escalated in 1999 when Tony Blair announced the end to the era of Westphalia, which recognized the sovereign rights of nations, and instead asserted that the great powers have a, quote, responsibility to protect, in other words, to launch regime change against those countries which refuse to accept the unipolar world order. And that's why we saw these wars against lesser powers such as Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, the idea that they will be forced to adhere to the rules-based order at the expense of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. Now, this was an escalation after 9/11, but something changed then toward the end of the last decade. And this was the idea that the war on terror was no longer a central feature for Western powers. Now, the war on terror was very good to the military-industrial complex. We had wars going nonstop, what Trump called the endless wars. We had military contracts. We had civilian contractors taking over huge projects and stealing large amounts of money in the so-called nation building they were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And we saw how good that worked how well that worked in Afghanistan, didn't we? But in 2017, under the influence of Generals Mattis, McMaster, and Kelly, all of whom were shaping the strategic policy of the Trump administration. Remember, Trump said no to endless wars, but his three top officials, all of whom he eventually dumped, but they drafted a new national security strategy document in 2017, which said that we're no longer in an era of a war on terror. We're now moving into an era of great power challenge. And that's against the, quote, revisionist powers, unquote, of Russia and China. And part of this new doctrine was the need to modernize nuclear forces in case they're needed in a war, not just in a nuclear war as a deterrent, but needed in a conventional war. Now we come back to Admiral Richards, who, as I said, is the head of U.S. Strategic Command. He said that today in February 2021, he wrote an article in the U.S. Naval Institute magazine in which he said we must shift from the idea that nuclear employment is not possible, that is, we would not use nuclear weapons, to, quote, nuclear employment is a very real possibility, unquote. This had been stated, as I said, in the 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy document. Now, on April 5th, that is 2 days ago, Richard in testimony said, we can no longer have the luxury of assuring that the risk of nuclear arms use is always low. Now, in his testimony, he and General Milley, and Milley is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, made a pitch for a great increase in defense spending, now over $800 billion, but verging towards $1 trillion, if you're going to fully modernize U.S. nuclear capability on the basis that we're now going to face the danger of what Richard called a nuclear peer reality from two countries, and therefore the danger of a two-front war. We have to have a major increase in expenditure, which is perfectly fine for the military-industrial complex. But for the rest of the country and the rest of the world, where austerity and shortages are looming because of the abject idiocy of the economic policies and now the war on top of it, this means that the rich will get richer and everyone else will be left to scrape the bottom of the barrel for whatever they can grab to eat. Now, there's a countervailing view, and I'll just give you one example of this, from someone who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia under Ronald Reagan and for a period of time under Bush, who has confirmed that the U.S. made a promise to Russia not to expand NATO eastward. That's Jack Matlock. He was on a discussion on CNN yesterday, and he was asked about the Bucha war crime question that was being pounded every few minutes on CNN. He was asked about it, and he said, well, one can feel outrage over the horrors of war, but the issue is how to end such horrors. And he said, against a nuclear power, There must be a de-escalation accomplished through actual negotiation. As Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said, negotiations were moving somewhere until this narrative of the war crimes came up, which completely threw out the progress that had been made in negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators. Now, what Matlock said is that any other path other than actual negotiation leads to uncontemplated horrors. To think that the world would benefit from making Russia a nuclear, let me read that again. To think that the world would benefit from making Russia a nuclear power equivalent to the United States, a pariah, I think does not really represent our interests in the future. I fear a world of that sort. In other words, a world where we're accustomed to great power challenges, up to and including the employment of nuclear weapons. That's where we are today. That's why our conference this weekend is so important, to discuss the idea of a new strategic architecture, which is based on an economic policy that goes back to the Peace of Westphalia, overturning Blair's idea of regime change as an acceptable policy, especially when you decide to change regimes that have nuclear weapons, that are nuclear peers. Instead, negotiation based on mutually beneficial policies are an urgent necessity. So join our conference this weekend. We have an incredible list of speakers. I'll be moderating a couple of the panels, and I can assure you it will be well worth your while for you and anyone you can organize to watch it. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back tomorrow.